Have you ever gone to a Horus Heresy event and thought, I'd really like to win one of those Army on Display awards? Well, here's my 5 top tips on how to set up for Armies on Display. Here in the UK, one of the most popular awards to get is the peer voted Favourite Army Award, or I Want That Army Award. Now, what is it? It's not just an award based on painting ability, so it's not like the best painted army per se. It's aimed at capturing or identifying or recognizing things like character, theme, using units that aren't quite that common, or it could be a meme list, or it could be an army that's straight out of a Horus Heresy novel. Now, the nice thing about this award is that it's voted by the players at the event on the day. So players will be invited at when armies are set up for Armies on Display. They'll be invited to wander around the room and they'll go, right, we need to find my favourite loyalist and my favourite traitor army, and I'm going to base my vote on whatever's the coolest thing. So the nice thing about the award is it's a lot more inclusive. It's not just based on pure painting ability, because whilst a lot of the armies in the heresy scene, especially here in the UK, are typically painted to a really good standard, like as a base level, not all of us want to endure the suffering of painting to Golden Demon standards. So it's nice because it can be won by pretty much any player at the event. So tip number 1 is army composition and layout. And this is probably the most important thing to consider when you're displaying your army. Now, I know that sounds like really obvious, but it really, depending on how you lay your army out, whether you set out, you respect the hierarchy of the models in the army, you really consider the scale of the armies, a scale of the models in the army, and how they'll sit next to each other, and how you can kind of create a visually balanced layout. And it's about the way I seem to approach it is that when I'm looking at an army, I want to be able to walk up to the table and kind of instantly get a snapshot into understanding where the HQ units are, what are the troops, what elites they're running in this specific army, and it's being able to readily identify and understand quite quickly how that army performs. And I think if you do really consider like the specific layouts or the hierarchy of the models, and when you display them on the table, I think that can make all of the difference. And I think personally that is what really gets people excited when they see someone's army. You can often find if you see like a really nicely set out army, you can sometimes be 1 or 2 tables away and you can see it over there. It's like, that looks cool, I'm going to go and look at that. So there's usually 2 layouts that I think that most heresy armies will fall into quite naturally. The first layout is a fan layout, where you've kind of got your HQ, elites, troops will be kind of like in the midfield, and then you've got your fast attack, heavy support, and Lords of War around the back. And when you visualize that on the table, you can physically see the army kind of in like quite an easy snapshot, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit more in a moment. The alternative, or the second kind of favorite layout that you tend to see, is kind of a square formation. Now, this formation generally benefits regimented uniform armies that are pretty much cookie cut. So you've got HQ and a transport, you've got all your troops with a transport. If you can imagine 2nd edition Ultramarine chapter photos from back in the day, really regimented, nice square edges, visually it just fills the table and it just looks absolutely amazing. Starting with HQs. So these are again the most important models in your army. They're the heroes, therefore you want to hero them on your army display. So it goes without saying that you probably want to position them at the front of the army. If you've got more than 1 HQ, for example, if you've got a Praetor and a Chaplain, or a Praetor and a Warmonger, for example, you might put the Praetor at the front, and then any second in command, second ICs, you want to kind of have them at the slightly positioned back. So me as the observer, or you can walk up and go, right, okay, that's the Praetor. Okay, he's got, for example, a Thunderhammer. And okay, that's clearly a chaplain because you can tell by his armour, and in fact he's probably holding a power maul or a Crozius. If you've got like a command squad, you might want to put the Praetor to one side with his command squad as an example, and then any other HQs separately, just so you can kind of get that differentiation, and it clearly demarks who's who and if they're running with a unit. Second is how you consider your elites choices. Now, again, these are typically the heroes of your army, specialist units. Again, you really want to hero these and you want them to be seen. So again, taking pride kind of at the front of the army. Depending on the number of elite units will always dictate how these are laid out, but typically you want your HQ units and then you kind of want your elite units behind. So again, it's clearly obvious. You're walking up, that's the HQ units, that's the elite. Next up, troops. Now, whilst these guys pretty much win battles, they win wars, you know, everything's carried on their shoulders, visually, hierarchically, they're less important. And I think these should typically be used to fill up the midfield of the army. These will fill out the bulk of the army display. Now, that's not to say that, you know, they don't deserve to be seen or shown, but just be, I think if you were to walk up to an army and all of the characters behind the troops, I'd be questioning that layout. If the troops have got a dedicated transport, again, you want to consider how the transport's going to be positioned next to that squad. So again, the person can walk up to the table and go, yes, that's with that. Okay, tactical squads, rhinos, that's really cool. And they can just, you know, it's very legible and easy to understand how it would work. Again, when you've got dedicated transports, you can kind of fall into a bit more of a uniform, regimented kind of layout. Whereas if you've got lots of assault troops, for example, obviously these are generally bigger models anyway with backpacks, you know, you might want to start considering a bit more of a staggered layout. One of the exceptions is probably recon squads and scouts, generally 5-man squads. Again, you can put those, perhaps rather than putting them in the midfield, you might want to have them skirmishing at the front, either flank, or if you've got a cool terrain piece, you can set them up a terrain piece to one corner or along the back. Fast attack and heavy support, I've included these in under the same heading because they, when it comes to armies on display, not battlefield role, but armies on display, they tend to have a similar function depending on the size of the model or the chassis size. When we consider things like HQ, elites and troops, they're typically of a similar scale. The exception to that is contemptors. So I'm going to talk about contemptors, fast attack and heavy support, because these are typically larger models. So contemptors usually find themselves in the midfield, slightly towards the back or on the flanks. Fast attack, you've got things like jet bikes, javelins, sofa speeders. Again, these tend to be, depending on the unit size, White Scars are probably the exception because they are all bikes, or sometimes all bikes. Speeders can look better, or you know, coming kind of round the flanks. Tanks, so you start looking at, again, sabers, they're quite good on the flanks, but when you start thinking about larger tanks like Sicarans, Land Raiders for whatever reason, Arquiters, I'm looking in the model cabinet to give them a reminder of what some examples might be, but you know, Predators, you know, they can be used as like a really cool backdrop to your army. And because if you go in the process of following these steps, scale wise everything should work and you won't be obscuring your models behind. Moving on to Lords of War, Knights, Titans, again, can be quite tricky because typically if you've got a large model in your army, you tend to want to hero that model. So let's just say, for example, you're really proud of a Kratos that you've painted. Well, it's quite a chunky model. And whilst you might want to have pride of, you know, put it in pride of place, you might want to put it right in the front so people can really appreciate the how it looks. For example, it's quite difficult to put it in like a prominent position and not obscure the rest of your army. So you need to be thinking about the scale of the miniature and the miniatures that are around it. So Kratos's generally can be put at the kind of middle back area or to one flank. It's the same with things like Typhons, other super heavies such as Fellblades, Falchions. They always look quite cool at the back on the side with a turret facing forward, for example. Knights and Titans, again, I think it depends on the posability of the model and what the stance is. For example, a Porphyrion, they have got a static kind of appearance, and they're usually quite good at the back, in the middle, with everything surrounding it, all the models surrounding it. Whereas if you've got like a Warhound or a Knight Lancer, for example, which has got more of a stalking kind of pose, these can be positioned to one side of the army. The only thing to consider, though, that if you've got a large model such as a Warhound on the flank, you want to be kind of thinking about potentially, well, how's it going to look visually on the other side, because it can start to become a bit unbalanced. Now, not many of us are going to be running 2 Lords of War, and probably won't be able to in 3rd edition. So what you might want to consider is that making the most of the terrain that's on the table. So if you've got a large terrain piece on one side and you've got your big Titan on the other, you can put some of the skirmishing units. You might put a heavy support squad, for example, in that other building. So visually, when someone walks up to the table, they can clearly see where everything is, kind of just in one big snapshot. And I think it helps balance out the army display. So things to avoid when you're setting up your armies on display. I know we're all respectful human beings, and the last thing we want to do is start messing up the event organizer's terrain. So sometimes we just put a long line of models along the front of the table, and because you don't want to interfere with the terrain, which fair enough. But I think visually it's really difficult to get a snapshot of the whole army when you're literally panning over 6 feet trying to understand how that army works. Visually, it's very hard to kind of get a snapshot on that when you're a typical kind of standing distance from the table. Another thing to try and avoid is having kind of a disjointed layout. So again, if there's a large terrain piece right in the middle of the board, try and what I would suggest trying to avoid is putting one side of your army here and the other side of your army on the other. Again, it just looks a bit naff. Now, I'm not encouraging you to move terrain, but if you're going to, once you've packed up your army, just move the terrain back and keep the event organisers happy. Because there's nothing worse than, especially me when I'm recording armies, going back to the long linear setup. I'm literally doing this, and all I can do is this, and it's really difficult. It takes me about 30 seconds to do the whole pan of the army. And again, when you've got a disjointed setup and there's terrain pieces in the way, I'm kind of all over the place, and it's really difficult to get a nice flow to record the army and make it look its best. Tip number 2 is lighting. Yes, it's really obvious, but if people can't see your army, they're probably not going to vote for it. The only exceptions to that is probably people like Ollie Mew, Lee Bates, Dawn's Arrow. Their armies could be in another room, in another city, locked in the dark, and they probably still win best painted, let alone peer voted favourite armies, because the painting ability is just insane. But it goes without saying that lighting is really, really important. And the difficulty that we have, particularly here in the UK, and to be fair, it's probably a worldwide problem, is a lot of the venues that we will go to events at, village halls, school halls, working men's clubs, the lighting is typically really, really bad. However, all you can do is make the most of what, this is a lifelong saying, you have to make do with what you've got. So I noticed that a couple of the old hands who go to regular Heresy events and often want to, we all want to put ourselves forward and hope that we might win an award, whatever it might be. Well, I've noticed over the years, some of the old hands are very, very, very good at finding where the best spots are for light in a room. The best example is probably Attrition Gaming down south. Neil and Reese, love you boys. Their old venue was at a working men's club, and it was a bit dingy. The room only had lighting from one side, so it was single aspect with floor to ceiling glass windows. Now in the program, it will normally say Armies on display will be on day 1 at lunchtime or day 2 in the morning or whatever. I always noticed that people who would like to be in contention for winning awards would always find themselves during the game before Armies on display with the light behind them. They'd always have the windows behind them because at the end of the game they set their army up on display, move away, and they've got all this natural light washed over their army and you can see it in its resplendent glory. Tip number 3 is remove any detritus. Remove your uneaten, your half-eaten sandwich, your empty can of Coke, your beer bottles, whatever. You know, once you've set your army up, you've found a really good spot, you've got some good lighting. The worst thing you can do is leave half a ham sandwich just sat next to your army, because if I'm going to come over and film it, for example, I ain't going to touch that, and people are going to be drawn to the half-eaten sandwich and not your army. So once you've set your army up, take a step back and just do a quick sweep and just go, oh, that needs to go, or you know, there's loads of dice over there, I'll just move that out of the shot. So when people walk over, they've got a clean view of your army. I think one of the biggest compliments you can have is when someone actually pulls a chair up, sits down and actually really looks at your army, and they take 3 or 5 minutes just really appreciating the time and effort you've put into your army. That's a massive compliment. I absolutely love seeing when that happens, and it even happened to me once. Um, but once you've set up your armies on display, I think one of the worst things you can do is sit in front of your army on your phone, completely disengaged. Now, I fully recognise that if you're not bothered about armies on display, if you don't, or you might be worried that someone's going to come over and nick your army or whatever like that. To the best of my knowledge, that's never happened in the UK heresy scene, or damage your army. But fair enough. If you don't want to leave your army, that's fine. But I genuinely do believe if you're sat back on your phone, spread out, whatever, eating your lunch right in front of your army, people are going to be less inclined to come over and actually have a proper look. You want to just leave your army there. People can come over, have a really nice look at it, and they'll go, yeah, okay. It's one less barrier for someone to come over and have a look. Tip number 4 is the position in the room. It's just like retail. You want to be in a prime position with loads of throughfare. You want people walking past your table all the time. You want to be in a really busy position where everyone's going to be walking past and everyone's going to be seeing your army. A lot of events tend to be in more than one room, and I tend to find that if you're in the second or third rooms, if you're not in that primary room, less people are inclined to kind of wander around the other halls. Equally, if you've just played a game and you're at the end of a row of 4 tables with no throughway, again, people will be less inclined to walk down there, have a proper look, and keep on zigzagging around all the tables. It's just unfortunate. It's just human nature. We can be quite lazy, myself included. And despite the best effort of event organisers saying, when you submit this form, have you been around everyone's army? Have you been into the second hall, for example? Ultimately, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But you can drown it. Now, in my eyes, the prime spot is at the end of a row of tables, nearest kind of a main entrance and exit into a hall. Maybe 1 or 2 tables in, just so when people can walk in, they'll just go see your army. It's really well laid out. You've thought about the hierarchy and the scale of models. You've got really good lighting, really good position. People are going to walk over and just go, yes, that's really cool. And that might be one of the first armies they see when they walk into the room. And then they'll go around and look at all the others and go, no, I've already made the decision. That army is the army for me. So tip number 5, this is surprising how many people don't actually do this. You've set your army up, you've got a really good spot, you've got really good lighting, but you've not written your name down. You need to, how are people going to vote for you if they don't know who you are? Now, there's loads of different ways that you can, incorporate your name into your display. You can just literally write it down on a bit of paper. There's some really creative ways of doing it. I think Pete King is probably someone who springs to mind, who, for his word bearers, for his black shields, he's always incorporated really cool ways of, with the theme of his army, he'll also incorporate his name and his Instagram handle, Angle Bear or Angel Bearer. Another person who I think really stands out at events, not just because he's a very good looking guy, but also that his armies, the way that he sets his armies up, is my good buddy Mark, Denmark from Denmark. EC Artificers, Emperor's Children. His army always stands out. He paints to such a high standard, and it always blows my mind that he's probably been painting his Emperor's Children for over a 5-year period, and the purple is almost identical from when he started to models that he's still painting today. So the way that Mark sets up, Mark's very creative, he's very artistic, he's a furniture maker. So you can really tell that when you see his army displayed, he really considers how everything sits. He's got loads of cool little conversions, he's got loads of cool really extra bits. Quite a lot of us in the Heresy scene will often include like an army display. So it kind of validates what your army actually is. So it's about adding the extra layers of detail. Here's some of the examples. Mark actually gave me one of his, Vote Slanesh, which is made from printed on some MDF that he displays with his army. Or you can leave things like, stickers and whatever in front of your army is kind of another way of saying, it just adds like an extra another layer, and it really celebrates your army and the theme of your army. And I think, when people start to be creative, you can come up with some really cool ideas. So there we have it. There's my 5 top tips to armies on display, and hopefully helping you move towards winning a peer voted army award. I genuinely would like to hear if I've missed anything, if you found that, obviously if you found what I've been talking about interesting or relevant, and equally if you use these 5 tips and you have some success, please let me know. Please like, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next episode. Here in the UK, we often have a "you can fuck off" fly. Motherfucker. Tip number 2, lighting.